Everyone, you're all very welcome. I think we're going to make a start. I think there's still some people joining at the moment, but we've got a bit of a tight schedule, so we'll make a start. Let me go back to my screen share. So you're all extremely welcome to the Plan Vivo webinar, Nature-Based Solutions, the Opportunities and Challenges for Blue Carbon. I'd like to just at the start say a very big thank you to all the panel members who you'll meet in more detail later, but Professor Mark Huxham, Mark Beeston, Robin Schilland, Leah Glass, Dr. Ryan Merrill, and Dr. Blanca Bernal. Also a big thank you to the Plan Vivo team for helping to organize this, especially to Carmen and Eva. So your program today is a short welcome from me, which will be followed then by an introduction to blue carbon from Professor Mark Huxham. We'll then have a presentation on the Fair Carbon platform by Mark Beeston. And after that, we'll split into a panel discussion, which will be chaired by Professor Mark Huxham. And the panel discussion will answer some questions, but there'll be some time at the end for Q&As from the audience. A couple of housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded. Also, some people have been asking already, but because of the amount of attendees, audio and video will be kept on mute. If you have questions, we'd really like you to participate, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. You can put your own question, or you can also vote for an existing one. And we'll try and cover as many of those questions as we can. There's an email address at the end if your question wasn't answered, which you can email, and we'll do our best to pass on to the relevant person. So just a very quick introduction to Plan Vivo for those of you who maybe don't know who we are. Just a quick introduction on why we exist. Well, as many of you will know, one of the key contributors to climate change, adding up to about 20% of emissions, is agriculture, forestry, and land use. So a lot of our work is in this space because, number one, because of the actual contribution that makes to climate change, but also because in a lot of cases, the people on the far end of the climate change impact are vulnerable rural communities. So they're at the front line of that. So our model is built around trying to address the contribution here on climate change, but also to work with those people most affected by it. So we are a charitable foundation and also a voluntary carbon standard with over 25 years experience. Central to our model is working directly with those mostly affected by climate change. And by that, we mean smallholders and rural communities, often in developing countries across the world. And our model is very much about putting smallholders and communities at the center of the design process, about empowering them, and about designing sustainable land use projects. Through those projects, these communities and smallholders can access the voluntary carbon market. And part of our model is that they get equitable benefits from the potential funding that comes through that, through the sale of carbon credits. So that's a key element of our model. And we have a holistic model where carbon is essentially an enabler for some of the other benefits that come from such an approach. For example, long-term livelihood benefits or strengthening resilience, and also biodiversity conservation. I'll just finish with a quick overview of the impact we've had since we started just over 25 years ago. To date, in terms of climate impact, we've contributed to over 5 million tons of CO2 emission reductions, and our projects have planted over 12 million trees across the world. In terms of social impact, we're reaching almost 90,000 people now. And in terms of nature biodiversity impact, we have almost 175,000 hectares under land management and 130,000 under conservation. In terms of the financial support, sales of Plan Vivo certificates to date total $30 million US, and 60% of that have gone back to communities on the ground. So I'll stop there, but again, just really welcome to everybody. Delighted you guys could all join us today, and looking forward to a really interesting panel discussion. So back to our program, I'm going to pass now on to Professor Mark Huxham, who's going to give an introduction to blue carbon. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Keith. Can you give me a thumbs up that you're hearing me? That's great. So really delighted to be here. It's really impressive and heartwarming to see what Plan Vivo has achieved. And I personally have been working with Plan Vivo for almost a decade now, and it's always been a great experience. So great privilege and opportunity to be here with you today. I'm going to spend about 3 minutes talking in very general terms about blue carbon, because some people in the audience may not know what we mean by blue carbon ecosystems, and also may not know what contributions they could make towards nature-based solutions to climate change. So any of you who are gardeners will know that the application of salt is usually not a good idea if you want your plants to grow, your flowering plants. So salt is a toxin to almost all flowering plants in very small concentrations. And that's why when we think about flowering plants, we don't think of the ocean. But there are somewhere just slightly under 200 species of flowering plants around the world that are capable of growing in marine conditions, in salty conditions. And these make up the blue carbon ecosystems, which are mangroves, seagrass meadows, and salt marshes. And I think today we're going to mostly speak about mangroves. We're going to refer to seagrasses too, but we should remember that salt marshes have an important role to play too. These ecosystems are marvelous in many ways and quite extraordinary in many ways. They're extraordinary because of that ability to thrive under marine conditions, salty conditions. They protect the coastline from erosion. They can respond to sea level rise by elevating the sediment surface, for example, of mangrove forests. They provide nurseries for fish. They provide habitats for all sorts of important biodiversity. So there are many, many arguments for conserving these habitats. But one of those arguments, and the one we're concerned with today, of course, is around carbon. And they tend to be, there's a lot of variation, but they tend to be quite exceptional carbon sinks. So they're exceptional in a number of ways. Mangrove forests, for example, typically store around 8 times the amount of carbon in a terrestrial forest. And they're able to, so it's not just the stocks that they're exceptional with, they also are able to collect that carbon at very fast speeds. So up to 50 times the rate of sequestration in a mangrove forest compared, for example, to a tropical forest. A key part of, an important part to understand is that nearly all of that carbon is below ground. This is particularly the case for seagrasses. So 98% of the carbon, or even more, that you find in a seagrass meadow is buried below ground, but 90% typically in a mangrove as well. So the carbon is in sediments, it's in marine sediments, and it can stay there for hundreds, thousands, or thousands of years. It's a permanent or semi-permanent carbon store. And although these habitats cover perhaps less than 0.5% of the total area of the oceans, they're responsible for almost 50% of all the organic carbon that is buried in the oceans. So that gives you a feel for just how powerful they are as a natural solution to capture and to store carbon. So there's no question, the science is very good, particularly on mangroves, and there's no question that they're a very powerful nature-based solution. However, the caveat is that they're quite rare habitats compared to terrestrial forests. So mangroves cover around 140,000 square kilometers. Seagrass maybe 250 to 350,000 square kilometers. That's plenty of habitat, but it's a very small fragment compared to all tropical forests, for example, less than 1% of the area of tropical forests. So although they're very powerful on a per unit area basis, that blue carbon habitats are not going to solve climate change for us. However, they're an important part of the solution. So recent analyses have suggested that somewhere between 14 to 20% of all the kind of reasonably economically attractive mitigation options involving nature-based solutions could involve blue carbon habitats. So that gives us an idea of their scope and their potential. And we're fortunate to have with us today Mark Beeston. Mark is a wetland ecologist. He's worked in marine and freshwater systems. He's got expertise in carbon cycling in mangroves, and he's been working with the Gallifrey Foundation over the last year or so to produce their recent report, Mind the Gap. And that report is looking at this the potential for blue carbon ecosystems, particularly mangrove ecosystems, to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation, but also considering some of those challenges. So Mark, you're very welcome. It's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Beeston and I work with the Gallifrey Foundation based in Geneva. Now, we've been seeing an increasing demand for blue carbon credits, but there's very few projects actually producing them. The Makoko Pamoja Mangrove Project first offered verified carbon credits on the voluntary market in 2014, so 7 years ago. And yet, in that time since, we've only seen a handful of other projects achieve verification, including but not limited to Conservation International with their recent work in Colombia, WIF in Myanmar, and Tahiri Honku in Madagascar. And we're joined on our panel later by team members from both Makoko Pamoja and Tahiri Honku. So why is it that there are so few projects, and what do the challenges and opportunities for blue carbon look like? We spoke directly to people active in the field and asked them to describe the challenges they faced. We then sorted these into scientific or technical challenges, political or legal, and also social and financial. Those challenges most commonly encountered we detailed in our report, Mind the Gap. A few less common included problems with corruption and having to pay bribes to resolve land tenure or ensure employee safety. Now, I just want to highlight, it's important to recognise that these issues don't exist in isolation from each other. For example, the science behind mangrove restoration and carbon measurement is strong, but finding the right resource you need to meet the technical requirements of accreditation and understanding how to apply it, that represents a significant upfront investment of time and human resources, and that's on top of needing to raise additional funds to meet the costs of accreditation and third-party verification. There's also a continuing trend to report the number of trees planted as a measure of achievement. This is driving the continued use of out-of-date mass planting methods, which have a high rate of failure, unlike ecosystem-based restoration, which, if applied well, can be very successful. Investors see this failure risk, apply it across mangrove carbon projects, and it deters investment. Meanwhile, we're seeing groups marketing unverified carbon benefits based on the number of trees that they are planting or intend to plant, irrespective of how many are actually going to survive or store any carbon. Now, there's a whole world of difference between carbon credits issued by a reputable standard and these dodgy offsets, but that's not always apparent, and so carbon income is often not viewed as a valid or trustworthy source of conservation funding. Now, we set out to identify challenges, but we're also presented with a lot of solutions. Everyone we spoke to had a different piece of the puzzle, and the overwhelming feedback we got from our report was, there's some good ideas here, so what are you going to do about it? Well, 12 weeks ago, we launched the Fair Carbon Project to make some of these solutions a reality. Firstly, we've developed a modular framework to guide project managers through the accreditation process and reduce that big upfront cost in time and human resources. We analysed the technical documents of successful projects, broke them down into the core data they provided and the legal and social procedures they followed. And from this, we are creating task by task, step by step process, backed up with the appropriate methodologies to complete each task, and tailored for use in different countries. And being independent and neutral, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We can happily include the existing best resources available and concentrate our energy on putting it all together and making it work. Now, facilitating the transfer of knowledge into the hands of practitioners where it can make the most difference is one thing. But if we really want to unlock the potential of blue carbon to fund ecosystem restoration, we have to address these issues of trust and of risk. To that end, we are creating an open access mapping platform where anyone can discover, view, and compare blue carbon projects. Now, this screen grab is from our proof of concept website. It's only a few weeks old and still under construction. But what we're working towards is a multi-layered interface which looks more like this. And here you can click on a project, see who manages it, which standard certified it, and even where just to click through and buy credits. And again, because we're neutral, not funded by any particular carbon standard or project developer, we're able to display all projects on an equal footing. Now, standards do make a lot of information publicly available, but currently you need to know where to go to find it. With this, in one click, you can access a project's technical and financial documents, you can see that their carbon claims are legitimate and how their funds are spent. And this easy access to key information builds trust. It increases transparency and it de-risks investment in blue carbon. Now, of course, this is a huge task, and we are not taking this on alone. We've partnered with organisations who are able to share their knowledge and expertise with us, and we've also recruited a panel of advisors and local contributors from around the world. But obviously, I'm not in a position to write about countries I've not worked in or people I haven't met yet. And once fully funded, we have an extensive wish list of further subject matter experts we'd like to work with. Now, my time is almost up. Before I go, I very quickly want to make two more key points. The first is that there's a lot of reporting on the theoretical potential of blue carbon to combat climate change. Now, theoretical models are great for scientists and researchers, but if you look at this photograph, on one side of me is a happy and well-managed mangrove, and over my other shoulder is the edge of a big city. Historically, that city was a mangrove, but nobody's going to bulldoze it to turn it back into mangrove now. So we have to be realistic, both in our expectations and in our messaging, because we can still have a huge impact. For example, since we began work on this project, we've been contacted by blue carbon projects asking for the kind of resource that we're developing, and just 6 of those add up to nearly 25,000 hectares of critical mangrove ecosystem and can benefit the livelihoods of tens of thousands of people. And our potential impact is not just limited to mangroves. Someone from Trillion Trees recently pointed out they wish someone was creating a resource like this for all the different terrestrial ecosystems that their partners are working in. And that's when it really hit home. We can adapt our framework to fit any nature-based carbon project. And the potential impact of that is far greater than we ever imagined when we set out to find out why there's so few blue carbon projects. And on that hopeful note, thank you very much to Plan Vivo for the time to talk today. Thanks to Mark Huxham, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into the panel and a good deep dive on mangroves. Thank you very much.
We're going to now move on to the panel discussion, and as moderator, I'm going to keep an eye on the time. So we've got some questions for all members of our panel, and I'm going to direct them one by one and introduce those panel members as well. So I'm going to turn to Mark, first of all, for our first question. Thanks very much for that great presentation, Mark. It was really clear. And part of that presentation, an important part, was your illustration of some of those challenges as well as some of the opportunities. I wonder if you could just summarize for us a little bit more, or go perhaps into a little bit more depth, what you see as the key, perhaps the top 2 or 3 challenges that are preventing us realizing the potential for blue carbon projects at the moment, and how optimistic are you that we can overcome those?
Thank you, Mark. Actually, very optimistic. If I kind of break down the challenges into a process, I think one of the first things we actually need to do is, when you have people in communities who are living in mangroves, how do they even know, how do you make people aware that there is an option to earn an income for protecting and restoring that habitat, rather than having to turn to cutting it down for charcoal or for any other kind of income. To that end, this month actually we started a partnership with the African Leadership University, just to build a quick marketing model of what that might look like and how you reach people, and what kind of form the message would take. Secondly, any potential carbon income has to be high enough to compete with the opportunities offered by other forms of income. This means that at the opposite end of the value chain, the people who are producing carbon offsets in the first place, purchasers need to understand the real value of what they're buying and the co-benefits that these credits produce. It's not just a way of ticking a box for your carbon footprint accounting. It has a massive change. It makes a massive impact on people's lives, and that's something that people need to appreciate. Thirdly, and this is the part where we come into play really, is to access carbon income, and to understand the individual and community level implications of setting up a project in the first place. There needs to be a clear source of information, and that's something we hope to contribute to. There's a lot of really good resources out there. I think the trick is to get it all into one place and line it up so you can follow it through from beginning to end. I could go on actually. There's always a lot. There's a real need for, at a national level, supporting policy and legal infrastructure to enable projects to function and get off the ground in the first place. And for us, this is actually a very key practical challenge, accessing that information about how in different countries you can legally set up, resolve land tenure, have a legal operating framework. That information is very difficult to get. So if there's anybody watching today, we do invite collaboration where possible. This is a team effort with a lot of NGOs and partners contributing. So my contact details are in the chat. Please do reach out to us. And before I completely go into all the different challenges, I'm going to leave it there and pass it back on to another expert. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. That's great. And it leads us quite nicely on to our next panel member. So I'm going to turn now to Leah Glass of Blue Ventures. Leah is joining us from Madagascar today, where she's been living for the last 8 years as the main technical advisor for Blue Ventures on their mangrove work, and in particular on the launch and the operation of Tahiri Honku, which is one of those currently operating blue carbon projects, which is registered with Plan Vivo. So Leah, my question for you follows on from what Mark's been saying actually nicely about the legal challenges and the political and governance setting of these projects. I know that you've worked closely with the Madagascar authorities in the establishment of your project. Would you talk through some of the challenges and the rewards of doing that, and any advice that you might have for other blue carbon projects?
Of course. Thanks, Mark. And hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So yeah, completely. Certainly mirroring Mark's comments. One of the overarching lessons that we've learned through the technical support of the Tahiri Honku Mangrove project, is that political engagement and support right from the very start is really key to the success of blue carbon projects. When we started our blue carbon work about 12 years ago, mangroves, they really weren't on the global agenda. Thus, in Madagascar, there had been, to date, pretty minimal government engagement in mangrove conservation and restoration. Obviously, that's changed now, but this was the case 12 years ago. With the goal of developing blue carbon projects, we actually use carbon sequestration as kind of the entry point in our initial discussions by conducting mangrove carbon inventories and then sharing this data with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. This helped to ensure that mangroves were included in Madagascar's National REDD+ framework. This was then like kind of an opportunity, as it basically gave us a nascent legislative framework to fit into, and meant that the Hirihunku project is actually nested within the National REDD+ program. However, one of the challenges was that the project, it developed alongside this framework. The team and myself, we really did our best to adapt to the changing policy and regulatory landscape, but this adaptation inevitably caused delays in the product, and at times, if I'm honest, confusion and disenchantment at the community level. So one of the key lessons that we've learned is the need to conservatively manage expectations regarding timeframes at the community level. Whilst we were, heavily engaged in the definition of the REDD+ strategy, as an NGO, we were not in control of the timeframes. Frequent changes in senior decision makers was certainly one of the reasons why the definition of the National REDD+ strategy took quite a long time. And one of the lessons that my colleagues learned was that, we realized the advantages of having MOUs with the various ministries that we needed to coordinate with, because if people leave, the MOU and kind of like which outlines common objectives and the rationale for a collaborative working relationship, that remains, that lives on. The last point I'd like to touch on, is tenure and management rights. Clear tenure, is an absolute necessity, not only for community-focused blue carbon projects, but also for marine conservation more broadly. Coastal communities, they can't be expected to conserve and restore coastal ecosystems if they don't have clear management or tenure rights. One of the specific challenges specific to mangroves, but common to legislative frameworks in many countries, is that mangroves are at once forest and sea. So they can fall under policies of the environment and forestry ministries, as well as that of the fisheries agencies. This can certainly be seen as an opportunity, as it recognizes, the real multifaceted nature of mangroves and the many benefits that they provide coastal communities and tropical nations. But in some instances, this can lead to contradicting legislation. I don't have time to go through the specifics of the process that we went through with Te Hirihunku, but our key takeaway, is to ensure that potential tenure or management pathways are really fully defined at the start of the project, and there is really clear understanding of the government authorities that need to be engaged in order to secure the appropriate level of tenure and management rights.
Thank you very much, Leah. That's a really clear and important lesson about engaging with the legal stakeholders. I'm going to turn now to Robin Shilland. Robin is a colleague of mine at Edinburgh Napier University here in Scotland, and she's currently working as a researcher on the Local Roots and Global Branches project. And in that project, we're looking at how the NDC process and how international policy on climate change can fit and support local initiatives, such as the carbon projects we're talking about. But Robin has been involved in blue carbon for 8 or 9 years now. She's been supporting Mikoko Pamoja and now Vanga Blue Forest, which are the two projects supported by ACES, the Association for Coastal Ecosystem Services, in a voluntary and now part-time paid capacity. So Robin, can I ask you, Leah's just been talking about some of the higher level policy, if you like, around REDD+ and the national governance. Can you add anything in terms of the local challenges around governance? So when we're working with communities, what have been the main lessons or challenges that Mikoko Pamoja and Vanga Blue Forest have learned? And I'd also invite, I know Mikoko Pamoja is working on seagrass as well as mangroves. So I'd invite you to comment on anything relevant to seagrass as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, firstly, I guess I'd echo what Leah was discussing on the importance of these strong management frameworks that underpin the projects. So our Makoko Pamoja and Vanga Blue Forest projects have their management rights devolved under co-management agreements between the government of Kenya and the community group. So although this co-management structure had previously been implemented in terrestrial forests in Kenya, Makoko Pamoja was the first project, first mangrove project to be managed in this way. So we initially faced a challenge in bringing together the right stakeholders at local and national governments and other stakeholders, and working through the logistics of how we would approach this management in a very different environment, kind of both physical and political to terrestrial forests. But this governance framework has also brought benefits both to the government and to the community. So in the government's case, the devolved management rights to the community has been able to plug a gap in their capacity to enforce existing legislation that is on paper supposed to protect the mangrove forests. In terms of community benefits, it allows the community to implement locally appropriate management interventions and for communities to directly benefit from that management. I would say that one challenge that blue carbon and other carbon projects may face in coming years is how the international climate change policy landscape is changing and what that means for national, for local level and community managed projects. So the latest round of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, has just been submitted, and interest in including blue carbon in these is rising, which on the face of it is positive if it brings kind of national scale blue carbon conservation. But there is a risk that community engagement with and the governance of these management interventions may be overlooked when blue carbon protection and restoration is scaled to a national level. And yeah, Mark mentioned that we've been exploring how we can incorporate seagrass into our projects. So that's brought with it its own set of challenges on various levels, including in governance. And I think the key thing here is we're kind of engaging with a very different set of stakeholders in the very much the kind of subtidal area, as opposed to the subtidal and intertidal where the mangroves are. So we are kind of expanding into the fishing community who weren't directly as impacted by the mangrove interventions. So kind of engaging with those stakeholders, making sure that everyone's kind of involved in the planning, right from the start, looking at management interventions, management areas, yeah, really kind of getting that stakeholder buy-in, stakeholder engagement, and quite crucially, kind of stakeholder governance right from the very start, so that local people are kind of very meaningfully engaged from the very beginning of the project. So yeah, Mark mentioned also the project that we're working on with looking at NDCs and community rights. So we are kind of looking at issues such as how the voluntary carbon market will change in coming years as kind of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is refined, which governs the carbon markets, how carbon rights might look if governments want to claim the carbon from small-scale projects like this. Will that affect communities' abilities to kind of govern and take a kind of direct benefit from these projects? So this work has really emphasised the need for financial incentives to protect and restore rather than to exploit, and to put local people and livelihoods at the front and centre of management. So doing this at really large scales of national scales, NDCs, will be challenging, but it's also really essential to ensure that NDCs are implemented in a way that not only delivers climate benefits, but also kind of safeguards community benefits and community livelihoods, and also facilitates systematic change beyond the project lifespans themselves.
Thanks very much, Robin. That's fantastic. I'm going to, so we've discussed a little bit at national and local levels. I'm going to change scale a little bit now and turn to Dr. Ryan Merrill. Ryan is a co-founder of the Global Mangrove Trust, which is based in Singapore. And the Global Mangrove Trust is looking at scalable solutions to help fund community-based mangrove conservation and restoration using new forms of finance and looking at global finance. So Ryan, I'm interested as a kind of naive academic who doesn't know anything about finance. I'm always interested in what people actually mean by that term and what the potential is. I know there's this idea that somehow there's these enormous financial resources that we can draw on, but could you explain to us how important do you think that the finance part of this, as opposed to the funding part of this, is? And what role can finance play in blue carbon projects and in blue carbon conservation?
Sure, thanks, Mark. The top 100 pension funds, for example, globally right now control about say $18.5 trillion in resources. So you're right. When we look at just the pools of institutional capital and oftentimes institutional public capital, they're impressive in their scale. If we think some economists in the Natural Capital Alliance community have made the Herculean task of trying to say what the value of Earth's natural capital is. So take this with a big grain of salt. But they throw around numbers of like $120 trillion. So, I mean, sure, that's short, but it gives you a sense of perspective at how much resources we as a species have placed in the control of just a handful of entities. That is important, I think, because as a community of practitioners, policy entrepreneurs, thinkers, solution makers who are passionate about blue carbon, we have to recognize that we have not succeeded in 20 years in tapping that opportunity. So the translation of the amount of hard work on the ground into institutional opportunities for institutional finance has not manifested to date at any scale. So there are no blue carbon bonds being deployed at scale globally. What we've seen is small engagements, like you've talked about, funding from grants, philanthropists, a handful of investment activities by private groups into discrete projects. But to date, no threading together of discrete projects has succeeded in producing blue carbon investment opportunities of sufficient scale to entreat interest from real pools of institutional capital. So there are groups working on that problem. Like we've had the pleasure of interacting with the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance and with Convergence, just two groups sort of looking at how we can translate the sort of projects like Plan Vivo is developing today into structured projects, structured products, pooling those together. And I think that work is critical to achieving funding or financing at scale, and also something that is eminently more possible now that we are able to lay hand on stronger and rapidly strengthening digital tools for translating complex data across great distances at very fast speeds with a lot of confidence in the quality of the reporting. And that's really quite new. So it's a very promising field and timely in its need.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And the last but not least member of our panel today is Dr. Blanca Bernal. Blanca is a marine biogeochemist with expertise in emissions and in fluxes in wetlands. She spent a lot of time developing user-friendly tools to help people engage with REDD+, and land use change issues. And she also sits as a mangrove expert on the technical committee of Plan Vivo. So Blanca, I wanted to ask you a question that pulls together some of the science and some of the governance and social issues that we've been discussing. A Plan Vivo project needs to balance scientific rigor with good engagement with the community. Do you think, and also spending on non-carbon benefits like biodiversity, do you think we get that balance right? And you know, are there challenges in blue carbon that are different from working in terrestrial forests around that balance?
Thank you, Mark. Well, I would say that the purpose of carbon projects in general is to reduce the amount of carbon that ends up in the atmosphere, either by stopping the loss of carbon or by increasing the carbon gain. And that has to be determined with scientific rigor in order for the carbon benefit to be reliable, to be credible. So we need to be rigorous in demonstrating that what we are claiming as a carbon benefit is indeed thanks to the project intervention and not happening due to other reasons. So it has to be additional. And so we also need the scientific rigor in determining how much carbon is in the ecosystem, how fast we're either losing it or how fast we're gaining it. And without this rigor, carbon offsets cannot be credibly generated. And if they are not credibly generated, the economic benefits that these offsets can generate may not happen. So these economic benefits provide the economic support to communities, like you were saying, and often fund the restoration and conservation that can guarantee that other co-benefits like biodiversity support do actually happen. So I would say that the scientific rigor is the starting point for these projects. And clearly field measurements and assessments are certainly expensive, but there are alternatives that are scientifically reliable and cost-effective, like, for example, using modeling to project carbon change, or using remote sensing, or other technologies that can facilitate carbon assessments. We can also use reliable default factors, data sets, and look at values that are representative of our project conditions. So there are options that will allow us to rely less heavily on direct field measurements, but are still scientifically rigorous, reliable, and cost-effective. And we have seen the development of these options being widely used for upland forest. Blue carbon projects are getting there, and the more we fund them, the closer we're going to get to having cost-effective standard approaches to measure and monitor blue carbon, while at the same time we generate quality blue carbon offsets that can support both the carbon assessment and the generation of the social and biodiversity benefits. An additional challenge that blue carbon systems have is that they are complex and dynamic ecosystems. So this means that the approved standard blue carbon methodologies are also going to be complex. And I would argue that even more so than other carbon methodologies. And because of this complexity, blue carbon projects often require the technical support of international experts, which is also expensive. But I would say that the more we invest on capacity building, the more approved and validated blue carbon projects that people can see and read we have, and the more guidance to project proponents that is made available by the standard, overall, the more familiar that we all get with blue carbon credits, and the more we're going to see these blue carbon projects grow.
Thank you very much, Blanca. That brings us to the end of the directed questions for our panel. I'm going to follow up with just three more general questions, actually, which originally I was intending to ask, put them open for the panel for discussion. However, I've got an eye on the clock, and I think we're running perhaps 5 minutes late. So I'm going to be a bit more directive than I'd planned. I hope the panel forgives me, and I'm going to direct these questions to just one individual. And if panel members really need to come in, then of course, please do. But my first question is, we've been talking a lot about carbon, and Tom Lovejoy, the tropical biologist, famously said that to value a tropical forest for its carbon is like valuing a computer for its silicon. And I have a lot of sympathy for that quote. It's a frustration, I suppose, as an ecologist who believes that mangroves and other blue carbon habitats are wonderful places that should be valued almost for their own right, that we spend so much time focusing on carbon, fascinating though that is. So I wanted to come back to Blanca, actually, given what you've just said, Blanca, about carbon. What do you think are there any dangers or disadvantages in this kind of continuing focus on carbon in these projects, in these blue carbon projects? Should it just be blue habitat projects?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, clearly the advantage of emphasizing the role of blue carbon ecosystems in carbon sequestration is that they are getting the attention that they deserve, because blue carbon ecosystems are vital, clearly, not only for climate mitigation, also for climate adaptation and for livelihood support of both coastal and non-coastal communities, for example, by providing habitat for fisheries. But there's clearly some disadvantages that could happen. For example, falling in perverse incentives by trying to, for example, maximize economic benefit when the project maybe is not that viable ecologically, or maybe even viable in terms of climate benefits. For example, if you're promoting carbon sequestration over here, but then creating carbon loss over there. Another disadvantage is, for example, when the carbon project restricts the use of land by the local communities that depend on it. And some of my colleagues have talked about this earlier today. And what that happens if the project doesn't bring back any of the socioeconomic benefits that carbon credits have the potential to generate, we are having clearly a big problem. So I would say, to me, the key is in having sustainability and not necessarily profit as the guiding principle. And I mean long-term sustainability. Because carbon sequestration is good, we absolutely need it. But if we don't approach it by thinking, how's my project going to sustain itself over time? Or who do I need to engage to rely on to make it work? Or who is directly affected by the project and who can directly affect my project? Without these considerations, the benefits that we can generate today with carbon credits, whether it's carbon, whether it's biodiversity, or whether it is income, they might be easily reversed tomorrow.
Thank you very much. My next question is picking up on some of the conversations we've had about the importance of community engagement. And in principle, climate change is a problem of too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's a problem of atmospheric chemistry and has nothing to do with people. So you could make that argument, and some people in the climate change debate make the argument that we should be focused very much on, technical solutions and on measuring biogeochemical processes. As I hope everyone has realized, that's really not the Plan Vivo approach. Plan Vivo has that 60% commitment to local communities. And in my experience, we spend much more than 60% of both resources and of time dealing with the social aspects rather than the technical or scientific aspects. So I'm going to go back to Leah now and ask you, Leah, just how important do you think this emphasis on social engagement and on community engagement is with our projects? And is there a danger that we're overemphasizing it?
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think it's a really important subject. Personally, I think the community component of blue carbon projects, it really is absolutely critical. The livelihoods and well-being of coastal communities across the tropics depend on mangroves and other tidal wetlands. They're the cornerstone of climate change adaptation for these communities, because they provide critical defense in the face of sea level rise for over 200 million people, according to one paper, and they also underpin the livelihoods of over 4 million small-scale fishers. When these systems are lost, it is these people that are impacted the most. But in part, thanks to frameworks like Plan Vivo that really places community ownership and engagement at the very center of their standard, they also have the most to gain from blue carbon. I think another really important thing is, like most marine systems, blue carbon ecosystems, they're traditionally common pool resources. meaning that any project or initiative that restricts or changes access, it's inherently, which is inherently the case of blue carbon projects, it doesn't affect just a single landowner, it affects an entire community. And I think it's really important that communities are not simply consulted, but they're empowered to really take a leading role in blue carbon projects. I think the last thing that that springs to mind is it's really reassuring to see Plan Vivo and also many carbon offset buyers now starting to look at carbon offset projects through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. Doing so not only helps to highlight the many co-benefits, as Blanca was saying, of blue carbon projects, but it can also help to ensure the projects are developed using a more human rights-based approach, which is really critical for the further development of these initiatives.
Thank you very much, Leah. My last question to the panel is, I'm going to return to Mark now and direct this question to you, Mark. And I'm asking for us to think ahead. And this used to be a long way ahead, but I'm going to ask you to think 10 years ahead, because 10 years now is kind of a critical framework, isn't it, when we're talking about climate change? I think there's a general agreement that we've got maybe 10 years, maybe less, to sort ourselves out if we're going to have any hope of reaching 1.5 degrees. So thinking 10 years ahead, what would you like to see in terms of blue carbon, carbon offsetting, and nature-based solutions in climate change policy? What's the best outcome there?
Thanks. That's a big question. I mean, if anything, the last year has shown us that our ability to guess what's going to happen in the future is, miles off. Anything can happen. 10 years from now would be 2031. And of course, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of governments and businesses making commitments to reduce their carbon footprints by 2030. But there's often no clear plan exactly how they're going to do that. The willingness may be there, but the nuts and bolts is often missing. With that in mind, I think we'll see a scramble for carbon offsets to make up the shortfall in forward planning. And so that should drive increased investment into nature-based offsetting, drive the price of carbon up. And that combination of effects should hopefully translate on the ground into increased protection and restoration of natural ecosystems, and then the co-benefits for people and for biodiversity. So what I'm hoping for is that we're going to see acceleration in the expansion of natural ecosystems protected. I'm not in this for carbon accounting. I'm in it because I want to see nature protected and flourishing, and the reefs and rainforests I remember as a kid, I'd love to see them back and in good condition. So yeah, it's important to note as well that companies should be reducing where possible, and I'd love to see that come into legislation in multiple countries. That would be my wish for 2030, is that, sure, offset what you can't reduce. That's what offsets are there for, and there probably still won't be enough to meet demand, but reducing is critical. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. And you finished on that absolutely critical point, which I think it's incumbent on all of us involved in carbon offsetting in whatever way to keep on emphasizing that emissions reductions are essential, and that there's no excuse for in fact, I don't think it happens very much, but a criticism of offsetting is often that it's used as an excuse to avoid emissions reductions. And so we have to be very careful that that's not the case. It falls to me now to attempt to moderate the Q&A session. We're a little bit over time, but we have some time now to address some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. And I've been trying to keep my eye both on the chat and the Q&A box, and I can see we're overwhelmed with fantastic questions. So I'm really grateful to everybody out there who sent these questions. I'm hoping I'll invite Keith. Maybe I'll invite Keith right now, actually, just to comment on whether we'll have a chance to respond to these questions outside of this webinar, because we're going to run out of time to answer all of those. Keith, can you reassure people about how we're dealing with the questions?
Yeah, what we can do, we'll put up an email address at the end, the info@email. So obviously, yeah, it's been a great response, as Mark said. So if your question hasn't been answered, please feel free to drop it to the info@email account at Plan Vivo, and we can pass it on to the relevant person to answer. So yeah, apologies that we've kind of ran out of time, but it's been a great discussion.
Thanks, Keith. So we're not quite out of time. So what I'm proposing is I'm going to ask just two, perhaps 3 or 4 of the top questions that colleagues at Plan Vivo behind the scenes have been ranking for me, and hope we can come back to some of your other questions if these aren't yours. The first question I'm going to direct to Robin. Robin, one of the questions is, do you think it's more important to restore mangrove areas or to protect the mangrove areas that do exist? And perhaps linked to that, have you got any idea about how much it costs to restore or protect mangrove areas?
Thanks, Mark. It's a really good question, and it's one that we spend lots of time discussing with our carbon buyers and partners and donors and all sorts of people. I think because planting of trees is such a tangibly attractive prospect to people, and it's one that's been promoted by the environmental movement for many years and decades. But actually, in the blue carbon world and in mangroves particularly, it's restoration, at least from our experience, it's restoration that really holds the power in terms of carbon. So mangrove forests store massive amounts of carbon in the soils underneath, these incredible root systems that they have trap the organic carbon in the sediment, and that carbon can go kind of up to 8 meters deep in places. It's a huge store of carbon, and it takes decades to centuries for a forest to build up that carbon store. So it's absolutely not a quick fix planting mangroves. There's a fantastic paper that came out last year by Goldstein et al., which spoke about irrecoverable carbon. And by that they meant they identified various ecosystems across the world, including mangrove forests, that if we lost the carbon that's stored in these forests, for example, through deforestation, that carbon cannot be recovered in time in line with kind of reducing global temperature rise to 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement. So it's so important that we keep those stocks in the ground. But having said that, there are some fantastic restoration projects across the world, and I don't mean to say the restoration is not worthwhile, and in certain places it can work. I can see some colleagues here on the webinar today who've been kind of fantastically active in restoring mangrove forests, and it's really worked well for them. But it can be locally dependent. In our projects, mangrove restoration just hasn't provided the benefits and hasn't been cost effective or carbon effective to restore as it is to protect. Yeah, and in terms of costing, it's a difficult question. Again, it's a question we get asked about: how much does it cost to plant a tree? How much does it cost to protect a hectare? To give kind of indicative costs, so the Moja project is 117 hectares, and the vast majority of that is in protection rather than restoration. So I'm very much kind of speaking to protection here. We bring between $25,000 and $30,000 a year into the project, and alongside in-kind support through technical partners on the ground in Kenya and also here in the UK, that makes the project financially viable. However, there is also a huge upfront cost of the kind of hundreds of thousands that it takes to get one of these projects off the ground.
Thank you very much, Robin. And this links with my next question from the audience, which I'm going to direct to Ryan. Ryan, this is a question about funding. So I suspect it's from the perspective of a community participant or community project developer who's asking about what sources of funding might be available. Are there straightforward sources of funding to help restoration or protection of blue carbon ecosystems that allow livelihoods. We've been talking about offsetting, and I guess one of the messages is it's not necessarily straightforward as a source of funding. So any thoughts on sources of funding, offsetting or other ones?
I think it's very, very challenging currently in the current environment for folks to bring up a project from the ground. What we've seen in Southeast Asia is a variety of hook or by crook solutions where groups have spent years seeking access to public funds through Green Climate Fund or through Red Plus or through grant giving organizations, and been intensely frustrated by an inability to ultimately secure those funds and very, very high costs. What we're seeing just in the last few years are the beginning of some innovative startups around the edges, which are unlocking opportunities to make peer-to-peer connections. Some of those, I mean, our own work, Handprint in Singapore, work by Poseidon, by some groups in the United States, mostly in decentralized philanthropics. And I'm comfortable sharing like a one-on-one, pass the reference along. Where I'm hoping we're going to see advances in the next period, and where a lot of work is being done in the innovation grant giving community, is again trying to come up with solutions for threading projects together. Because frankly, the costs that Robin are talking about, the startup costs, the operational costs for achieving the scientific rigor that Blanca stated to be so important, do push small projects out of that market. They simply can't make it. So all of our work at Global Mangrove Trust, the work at Handprint, has been on finding shortcuts, peer-to-peer shortcuts to communities, and to try to pioneer technologies that will allow carbon assessment at scale and will allow pooling of projects. That work is very new, it's very young. And, you know, one of your other questions talked about the role of politics, you know, political courage to embrace innovation in the space, to relax boundaries around barriers to entry, I think are going to be critical if we are going to actually bring solutions to communities at smaller scales and make that a viable solution for climate action and blue carbon in the next 10 years. So I think it's a challenging space. I wish I had easy solutions. And I think there's a lot of promise in decentralized digital technologies and in global collectives. I think those have just as much potential to produce a solution for a new entrant than the long slog through the existing institutional space. I think Plan Vivo, by the way, is one of the neatest opportunities for achieving that for new entrants. So I mean, I applaud their work very much in creating a lower barrier to entry on-ramp. So happy to share more, but outside of the webinar.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we're almost out of time. So we've got so many other interesting questions. There was another question flagged to me about blue carbon projects in temperate as opposed to tropical environments. And generally speaking, there's far more carbon in the tropical environments. So they tend to be particularly in mangroves, but there is carbon, of course, in our temperate seagrass and salt marsh. So there's potential there, but perhaps not as much as in tropical habitats. So I'm going to wind us up. I'm not sure if Keith wants to say a final word, but I'm going to thank all the panelists for their insight. Really appreciate you spending your time and sharing that expertise, and to thank all of the audience for attending.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, I think you've summed it up nicely. And thanks again to all the panelists. Apologies for the technical glitch earlier. I hope it didn't take too much away from the presentation. Some great discussion here. Loads of questions. We've had a little chat offline, and we're going to try and do a Q&A, which we can post on the website to answer the questions that we haven't been able to answer. So we'll take those questions off, and the ones that haven't been addressed, we'll put some answers up. Leah's kindly put her address there, and I think Robin as well, if you have specific questions for them. Also, I'm just going to quickly share with you, the info at account here, info@planvivofoundation.org. It's also in the chat. If you have any questions that weren't answered today, you can also email there. But so really, I suppose, just to echo Mark's words, thanks for so much interest. We had over 200 people attend. I think about 400 people signed up. There will be a video recording of this made available for those who missed it or for those who want to go back on it. And yeah, lots more discussions to be had. This is our first webinar of the year. We're planning to have 3 more in the run-up to COP26. So we hope some of you will join us for that, not just on blue carbon, but on other topics as well. But yeah, big thanks again and a virtual round of applause for all the panel members. And thanks for their time.